Yeah, I'll be on in just a moment. I start at 10 actually, and I use the 9:45 to because I can't log in earlier than 10 minutes before with one of the platforms. All right, all right, all right. Hmm. There we go. And we'll turn off this one. All right. Now, I'm just getting set up with my screens. I've got multiple platforms going at the same time. And I do like to make sure that they're all working well together. Technology is interesting because the multiple cameras, the way it treats it is it can change depending on what programs I have running. And as a result, one of the things I'm moving towards is, and it makes sense, less and less technology, even though more can add value when it's working well. The challenge is it doesn't always work well. Let me just put a quick clock up here. How's everybody doing? Let me know where you're tuning in from, just in the chat. Just make sure I know some people are out there. Where are you guys coming in from? I just set the timer on the screen to 10 minutes, 5 minutes. So let's get this one set up. There we go. Now we're talking. I'm going to put this right here. Yeah, if anybody ever is interested in going live, if you haven't gone live before, I'm happy to have a session like this where we just talk about going live because There's so many different factors and choices. Like I said, I mean, something may work great, but if it doesn't work well on a bad day of a bad week, it's probably not something I want to go with. Just because when you're, especially if you have something scheduled, it's coming. The things are just coming so quick. It reminds me of road racing and doing motorcycle track days. They normally have you sign up and register, and then you have to go through tech, and then you go on the track. And we always joke that there's no hour that goes faster than the hour between registration and the start of the session. And maybe it's an hour and a half sometimes. I mean, it doesn't matter how early you get there. There's so much that has to be done. You think about tracks opening at 7 o'clock for 8:30 or 9 o'clock start time. And it's just a lot that's going on in that short period of time. So what I'm doing now is my last minute checks, making sure everything is running well. So like there's my camera. My camera's not on. I just figured out why some things were going wrong with my system today. My mirrorless, the DSLR camera's not working right. Not going to worry about it now. I'm fine. I'll just have to adjust. And we got the right things going there. Okay, so we got some folks out there on the TikTok side. I have some other folks. Let's see what we got going on with the Facebook and YouTube. And I'll be watching the comment section. I'll be watching the comment section, so feel free to drop me a note or a question and I'll answer it. And at the end, we'll also have people come on stage if you want. We can join the conversation so we can have a real live conversation. Since I'll be talking about neuroplasticity, I find it easier to be able to describe it and explain it when I'm answering questions because it's entering into how the person thinks about it, how they process it. And that's what's missing when I'm downloading, is that you're not really hearing it in the context of the question or in the context of existing understanding. And when we're talking about the network of neurons side, what's traditionally thought of as the subconscious, there's no way of knowing what kind of reactions people are having inside that 600 milliseconds. And that's why neuroscientists will often say, well, we don't know. It depends. Everybody's different. And the way I describe it, I describe the network of neurons versus the conscious mind and neuroplasticity. I describe it in a way that is actionable and practical and can be used. Neuroscientists tend to get into the parts of the brain and they get into the exact research and mechanics of the brain. One, because they're focused on they're doing potentially peer-reviewed research, and they have to be exact and they have to build on what came before them. But as a result, it gets very difficult for lay people to understand. When I say lay people, anybody who's not a scientific researcher in that space. And if you start looking at neuroscience, every description seems to introduce a new term, a new definition, and that makes it very difficult to grasp. So that's why I talk about it more in a linear sense, even though we know it's not linear, it's much more like a network. I talk about it like it's sequential. We know it's not sequential. It's much more like a iterative looping system, like looping 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's more like that. And it's happening at millions of bits per second, so it's extremely fast. All right, I've got enough people join in. Let me know if you have questions, comments. We will be doing a masterclass today. I'll be going through the 4 pillars of neuroplasticity. In the process, I'll be explaining how to apply, the 4 pillars of self-mastery, and I'll be talking about how to apply neuroplasticity, because that's a big part of it. Most of what you have learned, have heard, understand when it comes to personal development, changing habits, and things of that nature have to do with the conscious mind side, and that's why they don't work. The conscious mind just can't keep up. So with that, let's just jump in. All right, so we're talking about the 4 pillars of self-mastery: conquer anxiety, strengthen relationships, and create unshakable confidence. I talk about creating unshakable confidence because stability is not actually suppression or control as much as it is immediate recovery, immediate reset. If you look at a car, if you look at a race car driver on the track, you'll often see that if you look in the cockpit, you'll see the hands moving very, very short, very abrupt, but they're moving very, very quick, very quickly. But yet, when you watch the car, it's like super smooth. One of the ways, and I used to teach performance driving. I've also raced motorcycles, and I do track days on motorcycles. And in motorcycles too, when you're coming out of the turn, a lot of times you're managing that slide. It's sliding and you're managing the slide. Now traction control is doing a lot of it, but you're still managing on that razor edge. But on the surface, it looks very smooth. What's going on is that you're looking at the hands through the conscious mind. The way the driver or rider is controlling the vehicle is through the seat of their pants, literally. They have over and over and over, the conditioning happens where you feel the car do a certain thing and hands adjust. So it's not like you're thinking, oh, the car is sliding, let me adjust. No, it's like as that input comes in, as it comes in through the seat, whether car or motorcycle, you're making those adjustments. You're also looking to see the frame in front of you, so you see how your car is shifting within that frame. So you have the eyes seeing a picture, and you have the seat of your pants feeling the vehicle, and that's that adjustment that's happening at that very, very rapid speed, but turns into very smooth. And that's the point I'm making, is that in life and business, stability is actually more about rapid recovery and resetting rather than suppression or control. Now, when I talk to people about neuroplasticity, this topic, it's an interesting one because there are generally 2 camps. One is that they think they've tried everything, that they already have been there, they've done that, they know about it. And then, or the other camp is that they don't really have anything that they're working on. There's very, very few people who understand neuroplasticity. As a matter of fact, the research tells us that less than 2.5% of coaches, now these are people whose profession is to work with others to get change, to create change and transformation, less than 2.5% actually understand how to apply neuroplasticity. And I'm not even talking about the next level of allostatic neuroplasticity. Less than 1% of the general population understands how to apply it. The people who tend, and this is, so I have a lot of in real life conversations because I have to make sure I'm connecting with people in the way that they think about this. The piece about neuroplasticity, besides people thinking that they already understand it, it's that they spend a lot of time trying to map it to things that they already know. And as a result, I find a lot of people have given up. They say, you know what, it's not for me. I can't do it. Or they've just pulled back on their dream. They're saying, I don't. That's not important to me. I won't do that. It's not that it's not important to them as much as it is they believe it's not possible because they think they've tried everything. Now, most of the people I'm talking to are over 40, and there's a different habit set conversation that I have for people under 40 versus people over 40, and part of it is just because of the amount of conditioning that's occurred. But if you look at this slide, the answer to the question, what would you do if you knew you couldn't fail, is seldom, I'm already doing it. What's your answer? If you knew you couldn't fail, what would you do? And whatever that answer is, then we have to say, well, what does failure mean? What does failure look like? And if it's something that's keeping you from doing what you really want, what your heart says is important to you, then what is it that you're afraid of? And that's different from I've given up, or not I've given up, but it's different from it's not important to me anymore. This is how I break through that facade that says it's not important to me anymore, when really what they're saying is, I don't think I could get there. I don't think it's possible. I don't think it's available to me. I don't think it's possible. Now, even if the answer is I'm already doing it, and I find it's less than 1 out of 10 people whose answer they're already doing it, and with those people we can refine it and go to 10x, because once you're doing it, then there's an opportunity for 10x. But for most people, they can't contemplate 10x because it's just too much. But if your answer is already that you're already doing it, is it a watered down of what's actually in your heart, or is it what you really intended? When you say I'm already doing it, is that the real it, or is it some watered down version of it? Now, a similar question is, if you knew you could fund your desired lifestyle, pursuing purpose and passion, what would you be doing? And this is another one, because people don't believe that they can achieve their purpose and passion or pursue it and make a living. Now, I'm not going to tell you it's easy. It's difficult because monetization takes you down a different path, and you have to deal with a lot of constructs that center around revenue and activity, etc. But I will tell you it can be done. And I'll talk about that a little bit, but this is the nature of the work, transformation. So the context here is transformation. It's like my camera looks like it's glitching a little bit. Like I said, I had camera problems this morning, so. Okay, now. A big part of this has to do with the pressure curve. So when I talk about the 4 pillars of self-mastery, part of this is getting a handle on our reactivity, a handle on the pressure that we bring to the table ourselves. We bring a lot of pressure into the situation ourselves. And a big part of this is getting a handle on that. I have this pressure curve up here, the inverted U, and this is showing that this is our optimal pressure zone, like the Goldilocks. More than disengaged in boredom, but not so much that we feel overwhelmed. And if you just wake somebody up in the middle of the night and say, the pressure that you're feeling, where's it coming from? Most people would point to the outside things. They point to things that are external. Well, I can show you today that a majority of the pressure that you feel, you're creating it yourself. And because you've been doing it for so long, it becomes a habit. So one of the first things I do with the exit ramp is we identify those habits that are in place that are causing the person to add more pressure to themselves. In other words, if being in optimal pressure correlates with showing up as the best version of yourself, and I can show you that you control the majority of the amount of pressure you're feeling, it's a game changer. Then suddenly the things that you thought were not available to you, maybe because you've had anxiety spirals, or maybe you've crashed out, or maybe you have this fear of losing control, whatever it is, once you recognize that you are actually in control of the majority of pressure you feel, like I said, it's a game changer. Now, people are going to challenge me on that, and I'm going to show you why. And I hope that if you have questions about it, you'll chime in, throw a note in the chat, a question, or even come online. We'll talk about it. But outside of this optimal pressure, you have unpredictable results. You have anxiety. Others' action change your results because once you're compromised in your own coherence, then small inconveniences can cause big impacts. And we know this, right? Because the more stressed out you are, the less tolerance you have for surprises and unexpected. And then, of course, uncertainty causes a lack of confidence. And when you get outside of this pressure, you're going to have uncertainty. So here's a view that we look at. The upper limit is like this ceiling that we have, artificial ceiling. Above that is this barrier, and this barrier consists of things like stories and bad experiences, violence, even good experiences, something people get locked in on. This is the only way to do it because that's the way that's worked, and they locked in that nothing else is going to work for them. And we have habit patterns, of course. That's what we'll be talking today. Things that your teacher said, things, discrimination, bullying. There's so many different things in here that cause us to fall back down. So this is not just an easy, hey, I'm going to break out and transform. You get up here, you fall back. You get up here, you fall back. You get up here, you fall back. And the reason we fall back is because of the habits that we're using are outdated, the methods we're using are outdated, and we have automaticity going on that we've been living with for years. Now, if you had breakouts, like big breakthroughs in your 20s or big breakthroughs in your 30s, and you look back at that, there was a lot of stuff going on around that supported that, and that enabled it. Maybe you was so much focus, or maybe you didn't have means, or you didn't have distractions, or whatever it is. There was so much focus that made that possible. So when I look at transformation, we start to recreate that. And let me just show you, let me jump to my pad, and show you an example. So if I do this, let me go here, and we're going to add this to the stage. And what's going on here? I want to have both of these up at the same time. I'll do it like that. So I was doing something on my other platform because I had to replace the camera. Let's see. Well, for those of you who are on TikTok, you don't see what's going on, but it's kind of comical. All right, let's see if I do it this way. this will work. I want to make this a little bit. Okay. Over there. Let's see if there's any questions so far, comments on the drawing. Not about my artistic quality, of course. I'm just talking about the concept. Because anybody who's gone back and forth between operational work and project work and had to do both of those, especially in the same department or the same function, they know what I'm talking about here. How many people just want to jump right to steady state because they're so used to operations. And then on the other hand, though, you have project people that's all they know, and they spend way too much time on the exit ramp or way too much time on the on ramp. But I would say in business today, the bigger problem is people want to skip those steps. And in business, it's not maybe the purpose and the passion, but it's understanding what are we doing, for whom, and why. Right? That's important to figure that out before you start, because that's how you're going to manage and contain the scope. Now, I just explained how this process works when you leave the comfort zone and start moving above through the barrier. And by the way, when you're going through this barrier, you get a lot of cognitive dissonance. And that cognitive dissonance, when you're transforming and doing the work the right way or what you're supposed to be doing, that cognitive dissonance is oftentimes neuroplasticity in action. So neuroplasticity in action feels like similar to anxiety because it's uncertainty. It's your brain is literally making new neural pathways. It's moving synaptogenesis from dormant or unused pathways or debunked neural pathways, if you will, to the ones that are active. And this is happening real time while you're awake. That's why when you go to bed, you wake up with new ideas and newfound courage, because most of the neuroplasticity happens at night. But it does start happening in the daytime, and that cognitive dissonance is what we experience as anxiety. And then it leads to other things because we start asking, well, what else is going to happen? What am I missing? There's anxiety. Why do I feel this anxiety? What am I doing wrong? Or it's never going to work and all that. But when you recognize it for what it is, which is cognitive dissonance oftentimes, it goes away. You don't even, well, I shouldn't say it goes away. You ignore it. You learn to ignore it. And you get the good night's sleep, and then it goes away because you wake up with the new neural pathways having replaced the old ones or the ones that are not useful, etc. So this is what I'm describing. We want to break through here from the comfort zone. We break through, we have the exit ramp and the on ramp, and then we finish the inflection point, and now we're now an allostatic corridor. The reason I call it an allostatic corridor is because this down here, this current comfort zone is homeostasis. Homeostasis is stability at the status quo. Allostasis is stability on an upward trajectory. I've talked to a lot of people, and I will tell you not 1 in 200 people understand, even have heard of the word allostasis, let alone understand it. The few groups that do understand it or have heard it, physical therapists, people who work in geriatric care, and some of your rehab folks, especially when it comes to the brain, they understand the allostasis because what we're doing is getting this new trajectory set. But for everyday people, they'll know what homeostasis is, but this allostasis is not being talked about. And there's a reason why. I mean, part of the reason is that it's in its infancy. You think about a 300,000-year-old brain. We've been hunter-gatherers for most of that time, and we still have roughly a quarter of the people on this earth are still living in something that's hunter-gatherer adjacent. They may not be doing quote-unquote hunter-gathering, but they're living without electricity, so they're living by the sun, daylight, nighttime, etc. They're growing their food, etc. So that's much closer to an experience that our hunter-gatherer evolved brain has adapted for. It is not adapted for a technology world with computers and networks and digital and AI. And keep that in mind. So when you look at neuroscience research, it's in its infancy. Neuroplasticity, while it was discovered in general terms, in the 50s, once they understood that myelin was more than just inert matter, it actually had to do with the path of least resistance. Myelinated neurons make up the path of least resistance, and path of least resistance, now we know, is a habit. We applied it to muscle memory. Martial arts, special ops applied it to muscle memory. What was discovered in the 90s is that it applies to cognitive processing as well. And that's what made neuroplasticity a breakthrough. And that's why I'm doing these live masterclasses every week, just to spread the word. There's so little known about it, and it's assumed to be things like positive mental attitude, mindset, NLP, law of attraction, manifestation. All these terms are used thinking that they understand neuroplasticity, when in reality, those terms I just mentioned, they use neuroplasticity indirectly. They are indirectly activating neuroplasticity. So why do it indirectly? Why not learn it at the source? And that's why I do these master classes, because if I can just reach one or two people out of 100, we move from 1% to 2%, and then 3%. It's going to be a while, right? But here's the thing. So we got this allostatic corridor. So we've gone from this into this. And this may look, kind of like ambitious, but I'll tell you, once you get above here, there's a new problem. And that new problem is infinite possibilities. Now you're in the field of infinite possibilities. Joe Dispenza describes this similarly. He talks about crossing the river, and then in the field of infinite possibilities, so many opportunities, endless options, unfamiliarity. All of that creates this stress because the subconscious does not like the unfamiliar. It treats it as a threat. So a big part of what we do with this pressure curve is retrain ourselves. That's why I have the 7-step reset you see behind me. We retrain ourselves so we don't add more pressure into this situation. Now here's the first pillar, fundamentals of cognitive performance. The subconscious is not a mind. I've talked around that quite a bit already. It's a network of associations fueled by neurons that form passive least resistance, aka habit patterns. Those habits live in the neural pathway. So if you were a neuroscientist and you had access to neuroimaging, you could see that there's myelin on the neurons and you could see which paths are lighting up and how much they light up and when they light up, and it maps to habits. So all that we learned about the subconscious mind, and it's been called a mind since probably 1820. So for of the last 200 or so years, it's been a mind in the research labs for 165 of those years, and only about 35 years has it been known to be a network of neurons. But because it's in the lab for lay people, most of the lay people still think of it as a mind. And the problem is, when it's a mind, you have other things that create some problems. Thank you for that comment, and feel free to throw questions. I see some people chiming in the chat. Feel free to drop some questions, and I'll answer those as we go. I'm covering a lot of information, and this is actually a 3-hour session that I'm turning into 90 minutes or so. And in fact, not tomorrow, but next Friday, I'll do a longer webinar format where we actually walk through the exercises. Today I will not be walking through the exercises, there's not enough time, but I will be uncovering the 4 pillars. And once we work through the exercises, you'll be able to do some DIY with it. Now, we're mostly cells, 100 billion neurons, each neuron connected to thousands of other neurons, making up trillions of connections, and then another 50 trillion to 100 trillion cells, depending on what information you're using. So since we're all cells, there's a big physiological component that people don't think about. The whole 11 million bits per second that's happening in the network of neurons, you may have heard that. If you look at what's the processing speed of the subconscious, it'll say 11 million bits per second. If you look at what the processing speed of the conscious mind, it'll say something like 50 bits per second. To put it in perspective, artificial intelligence is processing trillions of bits per second, and what makes it seem even more terrifyingly fast is that our network of neurons, our subconscious, processes signal versus the conscious mind processes in words. So there's a conversion that happens, which I'll get into. But what makes AI feel so powerful is that it processes in words. So it's processing trillions of bits per second, and it's doing it with words, and that's why it seems smart. It's not anywhere near as smart as we think it is, or some people think it is. It's just really good at looking at what words go together, and by putting these words together, doing it so quickly, it looks like this. That's what they mean when they say statistically deciding which word should follow a particular word when it's answering a question or what have you. So we're mostly cells, and that speed is on the physiological side, so we have to take care of our physiology. And then this explains why physiology is a major determinant of your outcomes, yet it's disregarded. So I'll show you today why hydration is so important, why nutrition is so important, not just from being healthy physically, but if 90% of what you do is by habit, and habit lives in the network of neurons, then most of our lives are being run by the network of neurons, which means it's physiological. So the better you take care of yourself, the better you're going to be performing cognitively as well as physically. I've been talking about this for the last 4 years, and while it's difficult for some people to understand and grasp, it's not that it's difficult information. One is there's some new terminology, but the bigger challenge is a person listens to this through the network of neurons. So the message is coming in here, but the conscious mind doesn't engage until a half second. So it comes in here as a signal, converts to something that can be perceived by the conscious mind, which processes in words. And then that meaning is already convoluted because the network of neurons, the memory, the associations, thinks that the subconscious is a mind. So it gets discombobulated before it even gets to the conscious mind. That's what makes it hard. So you actually have to do your iterative study on your own. You do your research, you go down your rabbit holes, and keep mapping it back to your real experience. Mapping it back to your real experience, what that does for you is it creates cognitive dissonance. And the cognitive dissonance is a way that we can break beliefs. So if you have a belief, a strong belief, relatively strong belief, it's different if the beliefs are really, really strong, right? But if you have a reasonably strong belief and you're trying to break it, one of the ways to break it is to create the cognitive dissonance. Create examples where that belief didn't hold true. Circumventing confirmation bias. And what happens with the confirmation bias is it tries to exclude those counterexamples. So you have to get the person in the right state. You can't get them when they're under pressure. It becomes a conversation, becomes a more of a neutral state thing to do. But anyway, back to this. When it was a mind, we thought of it like we have to negotiate with ourselves. So you condition associations, you negotiate with your mind. If this was a mind, we'd be trying to negotiate with it. And now think about this. This side processes at 11 million bits per second, as they have down here. This side processes at 50 bits per second. Imagine negotiating, and you're on the 50 bits per second side, and you're negotiating with an entity that processes at 11 million bits per second. You would never even think about negotiating in that situation. It's just, they just fold your hand and go, right? And that's what was happening when people try to get change and transformation through the network of neurons. It just doesn't work. But when you condition it, now you're using the same exact system. This is like training a dog to sit and then lay down and then roll over. You're using the same system that they use for their instinct, if you will. And that's why it sticks. A dog doesn't sit because it understands what sit means. It learns to associate the sound of that word and the tonation to sitting, and that's when you teach it to stay, you put your hand up or something like that, and they're connecting the dots. So we condition the associations. I often talk about it as an example, like when you're training your dog, and I hope it doesn't offend people. So far, doesn't seem like it does. It does maybe cause a little bit of a thought, but the point is, it's very much like training an animal, a lot like training an animal, because this is something you're conditioning, cue, behavior. It's the same thing, but it's more complex when I talk about neuroplasticity, because we do get into this thing about managing the pressure. And I see my I see what's going on. Hold on. I see that I have one camera mirrored and the other one is not. There you go. So that now we have it synced up. So this is all because my DSLR stopped being recognized. I use a cam link for those of you who are into this. You know you have a cam link and that lets the DSLR send a signal to the computer. But for every once in a while it doesn't register. You do a sequence of steps and it does. But today there's something going on, and sometimes it could be as simple as a Windows update, and maybe a driver is not acting right. But it is what it is. So that this is important to understand that there's two sides. Daniel Kahneman wrote a book. I read this book in around 2005, and he gets really close. I had to go back and listen to it again because I've been looking for authors who are actually calling it who are not calling it a mind. I don't see anything in published works that doesn't use the word subconscious, but I can't find anybody who's not calling it a mind, not in published works, and that's because peer-reviewed is still treating it as a mind. So when you talk to neuroscientists off the record or outside of their research, they'll acknowledge, yes, a network of neurons. But when they write about it, they twist themselves sometimes into pretzels trying to describe how it's a mind, because that's what it takes to be peer-reviewed. So again, looking at research, consider that somebody's funding that research. Research takes years. John Baj, the author of the book Before You Know It, he studied priming for over 20 years. Fascinating. And one of the outcomes of that is priming has nothing to do with the weight or the magnitude or the accuracy of the prime. It has to do with what comes first. So you can have a low probability, low accuracy item come in before a high probability, high accuracy item, but the sequence is what rules. This is how you can get somebody to be worrying about the wrong thing just because of how we prime them. You can prime them on something that's probably never going to happen. They do this in politics a lot, but they get people focusing on the wrong thing and then they go off on the deep end. So anyway, in the book, Before You Know It, not Before You Know It, Fast and Slow Thinking, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. This is what he's describing. Daniel Kahneman in his book. So I went back through and read it recently, and he's describing the network of neurons in the fast thinking, and he's calling this the slow thinking. So if you read the book, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow by Daniel Kahneman, K-A-N-N-E, I think there's an H in there in it somewhere, an M-A-N-N. Anyway, Daniel Kahneman, if you Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, you'll find it. He describes this very, very well. And the reason he does is because it was the neuroimaging that came about in the 90s. That's why, and it's called the decade of the brain, because there's the breakthrough that, wow, it's network of neurons and muscle memory that works with muscles. It actually works the same way. The nervous system works the same way with cognitive processing. It's like, boom. But he still talks about it as a mind. But when he describes it, he's describing what's going on with the network of neurons. It's very cool. Next, we have the right side, which is the conscious mind. This is what we're thinking. This is the thought. Process is very slow. And what's interesting is the bottleneck that this creates is just enormous, because if you are in that quarter of the population that's still living hunter-gatherer adjacent, everything's fine. You're moving along. It's just right. But when you look at what we're living with today in Western culture, or let's call it the industrial, post-industrial era, post-technology era, it's not, we can't keep up. The 50 bits per second is not designed to keep up with the speed of technology and networking and all that. So the step one, let me back up, do a better segue. So on my 4 pillars, we're going to go through. Step one is the fundamentals and levers, and that's the understanding. So I'm into that right now, right? We're talking about the network of neurons. We're talking about the conscious versus unconscious, etc. Next, we go into habit mastery. And even though habit requires state mastery for it to be totally effective, I do habit mastery first, because I have to, some people don't believe that they can change habits. I mean, emotional intelligence told us that you can't change habits. You can't change, essentially, and right? That was in the 90s. It was It actually was created in the 1990s, popularized in the mid 90s, but that was around the time that the neuroimaging was telling us that it's network of neurons, so it was too new. So emotional intelligence content still says you can't change. So I do have to convince people that we can change, and I use examples to show them that you can change, and I break out habits in 3 different zones. There's the reactive type habits, there's the identity type habits, and then there's the behavioral type habits, and each of those uses a different strategy to change it. Then we have state mastery. This is what I was getting to when I was talking about the pressure curve. By managing your state, you're able to control the amount of pressure that you're feeling. And then the performance hygiene. This is an important one. I added this one later because there are people who do everything right and then get knocked off course, and you never know when that's going to happen. You never know when they're going to get blown out the water because of some surprise that happens. Some bad. It could be a bad actor. It could just be a change, but they run into this area where they get overwhelmed very quickly. It throws them into a loop, and they lose it. Well, guess what? A lot of that time could be improper nutrition, hydration, exercise, etc. But a lot of the times, it's some relationship, some little T issue from when they were 5, 6, 7 years old. Little T being some small trauma thing. It doesn't elevate to the state of trauma, so I call it little T. And I use the example of a kid gets ice cream knocked out of his hand, and people who he or she loves are laughing at it, right? And that laughter creates this wound, and they realize the world is not a safe place, and it's little T, and they suppress it, and they've suppressed it over and over. And then, as an adult, they have a interaction with somebody, and it somehow reminds them of that time when they were 5 or 7 years old, and next thing you know, they start anxiety spiraling because they get all these associations triggered. And it happens even more so when you're above the line, because up above the line, there's so much unfamiliar, and the brain is constantly looking for the next shoe to drop, looking for, where's this anxiety coming from? Remember, excitement and anxiety have a similar signal, a similar architecture. That's not the word I want. Similar energy, right? Energy's going through the neural pathways. Signature, that's the word. So when you get above here, anxiety, all the time anyway, anxiety and excitement often have the same signature. And people, when they're up here, they're already feeling on edge because it's uncomfortable. And they're excited, but it's treated as anxiety. And next thing you know, they go back down this hole. By the way, the spoiler alert is that here we're living by habit. 95% of what we do is by habit. Up here, what you do is you live by principles. You live by principles because the world will always return, like reversion of the mean. The world will always conform around principles because they're principles. And if you don't have the principles, you use near principles. That's why I use peer-reviewed research. Everything I talk about is evidence backed by peer-reviewed research. So we're moving now into the first pillar. And this is the one where we're talking about the fundamentals. So here's the fundamentals and the levers. It starts with my 7 performance areas: mental, physical, spiritual, emotional. These are the areas that we control. And then you have on the right side relationship, professional, financial. These are the areas that involve other people, and relationships is the one I was just referring to, where people can have these little T wounds that get opened and charged and create this emotional trauma for them, and it causes some problems with relationships. I've seen people blow up trust that's taken 20 years to build. You say you build trust going up the escalator, but you lose it like going down on the elevator. And of course, relationships are important for professional and financial. And what we do is we run laps around the mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, the ones we can control. Now, these are easily controlled initially, spiritual being the higher self, not spiritual realm. And then emotional is the gateway to the right side. So even though we control it, a lot of people have abdicated that responsibility, and they're allowing the buttons to be pushed. And when buttons get pushed, that emotional creates drama for them, and that gets us back to the pressure thing, because one thing adds to another. Once it's an emotional event, it's recruiting more anxiety, more neurons. To say the neurons that fire together wire together. And that's what happens. So we have to have a way of managing that. I use the 7-step reset to manage this, because each time you do a lap, there's new habits that unfold, and you build habits to leave the ramp, replace habits, I should say, as you go through the exit ramp, and then you build new habits going on the on ramp. So we're constantly using neuroplasticity, and the 7-step reset is the protocol for activating neuroplasticity. So beliefs stronger than willpower and discipline. Bar none. Beliefs will always overpower discipline and willpower. You may have had some great results using willpower in your 20s, maybe even your early 30s, but once the prefrontal cortex completes its formation, there's less and less synapses and neurotransmitter available, and you're relying more and more on your conscious mind. And if nothing else, I mean, the conscious mind, the energy wanes during the day, right? Because it's using metabolic energy to keep going, whereas the network of neurons, it's processing at 1,000,000 bits per second. The conscious mind just can't keep up. A condition from ages 0 to 7, that gets locked in. Back to the hunter-gatherer. It makes sense if you're a hunter-gatherer. Conditioning from 0 to 7, you're 7 years old, you're out hunting and gathering. It makes sense. But as a 50-year-old, a 60-year-old, 70-year-old today, your life today is completely different than it was from 0 to 7. You're not doing the same kinds of things. And I mean, while school may look the same, the rest of the world does not, right? I mean, for the people who are over 50, we didn't have computers in school. We didn't have laptops. We were doing papers on typewriters where you had to use whiteout and lift-off tape and stuff like that. Word processors showed up, I want to say, late 80s. In the early 80s, word processors where you can backspace. But before 80, if you went to school before 80, you were doing typewriter and liftoff and whiteout. So when those folks can type 70 words a minute with accounting for errors, they were typing. And then we have priming. It can cause anxiety and hijack emotions. I already mentioned how priming is more about what comes first and not the accuracy or the weight or the probability of the thing is what comes first. And that's problematic, because that means you can be primed with stuff that's not even likely to happen. I use an example of, since the unconscious looks at threat, there's an assessment about threat. And that assessment could be low, medium, or high. There's another assessment. What's the probability that this threat will materialize? Again, it could be low, medium, and high. Then there's another assessment that gets made. And this is happening in milliseconds, thousandths of a second. Another one is the urgency. How quickly do we need to deal with this? Low, medium, or high? And going back to a hunter-gatherer, which, by the way, makes neuroscience makes so much sense when you look at it through that lens. Rustling in the bush is a stimulus. We have to first determine, is it a threat? Is it a high threat, medium threat, or low threat? If it sounds like a bird, it's probably a low threat. If it sounds like a bigger animal, like a tiger, it's a high threat. So then the next one is the probability that this threat will materialize for me right now. If the bushes are way over there and there's a river between you and the bush, the likelihood of it materializing is low, or at least medium, and the urgency is low. So you get the point, right? But if not only was it the rustling in the bush, but you could see the orange like it's a tiger, now the probability is high, and the urgency, if there's nothing between you and it's high. Now, that makes sense for a hunter-gatherer, but as a business person reading an email, do we want to have that many things coming across in a year? High, high, high. I don't want that many coming across in a year, let alone a day. You don't want more than, in my opinion, more than one or two high, high, high in a year. And if you're getting more than one high, high, high in a year, then maybe you need to put some structural boundaries in place so that doesn't happen. And then we talk about that. Whereas the hunter-gatherer didn't have that ability because there's just bushes, and then they came up with weapons, etc., afterwards. So the mindset, fixed mindset, a lot of talk about mindset, and it's become sort of like a buzzword. And while there is peer-reviewed research around it, the more important thing about mindset is getting back to a growth mindset very quickly. We go into a fixed mindset when we're under load. So back to that U-shaped curve, the inverted U, it's very easy to fall into a fixed mindset. And a lot of times when I'm coaching with somebody, they'll go into a fixed mindset. They don't even know it. These people pride themselves on having a growth mindset, but they don't recognize that in one conversation, they can bounce back and forth, and sometimes they get stuck and fixed. So we really want to have an awareness and then moving to back to a growth mindset. And I'm talking about in seconds, not minutes or hours. And then the last one I have is under the fundamentals is physiology. And I've already alluded to it that if 95% of what we do is by habit, and habits are the path of least resistance through a network of neurons, then 90% of our lives are by physiology. And when you look at the nervous system, 50 trillion cells, 100 billion neurons, it's running a lot, it's governing a lot. And all that governing that it's doing is leveraging our physiology. The better you are physiologically, the better you're going to be at cognitive processing. So I say use neuroplasticity to reset your conditioning. And that's the theme that's going throughout this. I talk about using neuroplasticity to reset the automaticity. The automaticity operates at the same speed as habits, and that's where we start to make the progress. So here's it. The step one, fundamentals and levers. These all interact with each other. Beliefs can drive the habits. And by the way, you notice that in my, hold on a second. I talk about it as conditioning here, beliefs, conditioning, priming, but when I talk about it here, I talk about beliefs, neuroplasticity, priming, because we're going to use conditioning, and the way we do conditioning is neuroplasticity. So this is actually my diagram, but I use conditioning to explain it here. So all of these impact one another. Physiology can change your ability to access neuroplasticity. It can change your mindset. It can change your priming. It can cause which beliefs to surface. You may have one belief that's over here, but if you're physiologically stressed, that belief can change. And we've had it some days, right? You wake up and you're gung-ho, you're ready to do this thing, and something happens, or 2 days later, you're feeling a little bit low, and you think, that's a bad idea. This is not going to work. Your beliefs can shift back and forth that easily just with something as simple as physiology. And then step two. This is still in the 7-step reset. So steps 1 and 2 are pre-stimulus, and then step 3 is the stimulus reaction. Step 4 is the response. So we've learned stimulus response, but it's actually stimulus reaction response. And because the brain and nervous system are prediction engines, there's actually a pre-stimulus. So we have a pre-stimulus, stimulus reaction, and a response. And I separate all of them because each one becomes a lever that we can use. So we have self-awareness, and this may sound familiar because emotional intelligence talked about self-awareness, and then it also talks about self-regulation and then managing relationships. Coherence is a powerful one, and I have down here in the notes that we use heart rate variability as a proxy for coherence. Coherence is important because high coherence means low chaos and low rigidity, which means high adaptability, high flexibility. You need high flexibility to keep from going down into anxiety spirals. Back to that pressure curve, part of the staying inside pressure curve, the inverted U, is maintaining the coherence in such a way that we're not getting overwhelmed and we're not disengaging. We're staying right in that zone, and we're doing it proactively with habit. And then I talk about the present moment. So this area here in between the network of neurons, this is the conversion from the signal to something that can be perceived by conscious thought. This is that present moment. The more you can be present in this moment, the more you're able to discern whether or not the response that's being recommended by the network of neurons is the response you want to apply. So for example, if we're in a project, an operational environment, widgets in, widgets out, Most of what we're doing is the same from day to day. Chances are, as situations change, what's being recommended from the network of neurons is probably very much aligned with what you want to do. If you're in a project environment, every day is new, you're on the frontier, you're infinite possibilities, it's always something new. You got to stop and pause and think about it and do some analysis. Having that same knee jerk, yep, that's the recommendation, reaction, I'm going to respond, that's not going to work. This is why projects easily go off the rails, because people are applying their first thought of what they should do, but it's coming from an operational mindset. I don't know if that's making sense, but the more you are into transformation, the less likely your recommended reactions are going to be the right thing. And then we have rapid modulation. This is what I was talking about. Stability is not suppression or control. It's just like the race car driver is quickly moving the steering wheel and feathering the gas pedal to keep car on the edge of sliding. The car is literally right on the edge of sliding where the maximum traction is. And that's what we're doing with the network of neurons. We're constantly modulating that dynamic. So we're not waiting for the conscious mind to become aware that a threat happened. We're perceiving the threat through interoception. We're perceiving it there. It's like sensory acuity that we use in other people, but interoception is what we're doing when it's ourself. So as soon as we feel that spike, we don't wait for the meaning. We already know from the context that this is perceived as a threat. We can immediately modulate it. We can immediately modulate it back into calm, because we know it's not a tiger, and rather than wait for it to come across as a major threat, we intercept it and change it right then and there. We also use prevention tactics. So we remove your threat bias. Take the threat bias from something that's going to come across as high, 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 and we change it to none, none, low, or something like that. You still have the access to respond to a tiger level threat as a tiger level threat, but you don't need to be running this 99% of the time as a high, high, high. It just doesn't make sense. Why burn out your system like that? And then the second pillar, habit mastery. So I've been into the habit conversation for a while now, but there's three kinds of habits: behavioral habits, reactive habits, and identity habits. Behavioral habits are the easiest because there's nothing connected to them, and it's a cue versus response. There's a lot of what in the book Atomic Habits by James Clear. They're easy to change. Reactive habits are difficult. Reactive habits happen very early on, and there's three major inputs. External stimuli, like the rustling in the bush, right? You react to that because you think it's a tiger. Cognitive biases fire at the reactive moment. So now we have cognitive biases sort of escalating threats. And then we have identity habits, which are also difficult to change because they include both behavioral habits and reactive habits. Identity habits are constructs like personality, identity. These are constructs, and you don't change constructs at the construct level. You change them at the elements level. I see some people joining in. Hello there. We're going to go for another probably 45 minutes. If you have questions, drop them in the box. I will answer them as we go. And if there's time or enough interest, I'll also open up and come on stage and have a conversation about it. Eventually, I'll be inviting people who have some experience in this world so we can have some dialogue and conversation. I do hot takes. I did a hot take yesterday and a hot take the day before, and I would definitely have people in those hot takes because I can bounce ideas back and forth. Those hot takes were about cognitive biases and also leveraging the easy to change behavioral habits to change the amount of reactivity we're going through in a day. So we get back to the reactivity habits. There's four layers of reactivity. The one is an internal threat, and this could be like, I call it the hater reflex, where in social media, a person sees a post and they start lashing out and attacking the person's character. They don't even know the person. But it was an internal threat. It triggered something internally, that some little T, and they lash out because they get really uncomfortable. Other people might be doing it on purpose, but I'm talking about that internal threat kind of response. The other form of those internal threats is that there are people who've catastrophized so many times that they've made these associations in their brain that this equals that. And just because it's an inconvenience, it is treated as a major, major problem, and that's because it's got associated with it. So those are internal threats. We can solve those because you can use logic, you can do some reframing, we can use some transformational vocabulary, and that was what I was referring to when I said the hot take was we can use the easy to change behavioral habits to stop doing the cues that trigger the reactivity habits. The second layer is cognitive biases. I mentioned that. So confirmation bias, planning fallacy, sunk cost fallacy, recency bias, attribution error, all these biases. And I have on my website, if you go out to 7stepreset.com/live, 7stepreset.com/live, I actually have 36 cognitive biases that get in the way of development, personal performance. And I also talk about what zone they fire in. We'll get into the zone in a few more slides, so that'll make sense. But getting a handle on cognitive biases is important. And you're not going to have a response for every single cognitive bias. What we're going to do is condition in a trigger mechanism, that interoception, and then a very quick response or reaction that comes behind it. So it discounts the cognitive biases, especially if you're into the world of infinite possibilities. You do not want cognitive biases firing. If you've ever been in a timeshare sale or some high pressure sale and you bought something that you didn't want to buy, or even if you didn't buy, you experienced they were tapping into your cognitive biases. If you've ever felt trapped and you're clicking buy and you know you shouldn't be clicking buy, but it's like this momentum you can't stop, you've essentially have been the victim of following cognitive bias after cognitive bias after cognitive bias that's leading to you clicking buy. This is what goes into conversion. High conversion landing pages are leveraging priming and cognitive biases to make that happen. So just by installing a mechanism in yourself where you mitigate the power of a particular cognitive bias, the importance, the significance, you mitigate that, you discount it, literally just discount it so it doesn't have that same kind of energy. And then the next one would be layer 3 would be ego threats. This is like road rage. These are real threats to the ego, but not a threat like a person is going to hurt you physically. It's just an ego threat. Those are pretty strong as well. And think about the road rage you've seen. Road rage can go crazy. I remember watching this guy next to me, and the person didn't go, the light turned green or whatever, and then it turned red, and he's beating on the steering wheel. He's just crashing out, like, man. But that could have been a road rage incident if he was an aggressive kind of person. But he was so fight or flight, all in it, right? Just because of a traffic light. 2 minutes maybe in traffic that it cost him. And then we have the crash outs. This is real threats. So somebody's actually attacking you, or maybe a phobia response, a crash out. You respond really badly to news at work, and it turns into something bigger than a little bit. So those are the 4 layers of reactivity. We want to get a handle on those reactivity habits. And now the next one is habit mastery, addressing the 3 types. We already talked about that. So let's go here. And 3 types of habits to address: reactive, identity, and then behavioral. This zone here is your reactive habits. This zone would be your identity habits, and this zone would be your behavioral. So if you're looking at this and you think about the drawing that I had, the slide that I had, let's go to it. This one, this is the first 600 milliseconds. So it's 600 milliseconds because there's 100 milliseconds of pre-listening and prediction. So this is the first 600 milliseconds on this side. This is the second 500 milliseconds on that side. Or I should say the second half second. This is the first half second plus on this side. So that's the same drawing as this. So here's your reactive, your identity, your behavioral. And that's why these are easier to change, closer to the preconscious surfacing. And this is the conscious mind side. And I have my company's dynamic leadership, and dynamic leadership is about taking the best practices, the best leadership practices, and automating them. So we're not waiting for the conscious mind to come online; they're automatic. using neuroplasticity, obviously. And then again, taking that same drawing, now we have the reactivity habits. This is the readiness zone. So these are the zones of the 600 milliseconds. We have readiness, orientation, and mobilization. Each one is about 200 milliseconds. And this is where neuroscience would take me to task, because they would say it's not that linear and it's not that sequential. It's more like loops and feedback loops running through here, and it's more like a network, and there's a lot more parallel. But that said, you can look at it this way to understand it. So this is practical to make it understand. We're not trying to get peer reviewed. We're not trying to do a neuroscience class. What I want to do is give people access to the first half second where habits live in the automaticity, and then apply that automaticity to their life. So in the beginning, you have the pattern simulation. Then we have the threat level is a sign. This is where I was saying, is it low, 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 or high, high, high? And we want some of those, it's not a threat at all. That's what we condition. That part is not simple. It's straightforward. It's 6 weeks training. You are training your subconscious 6 weeks, a minute and a half in the morning, noon, and then evening. Less than 5 minutes a day is all it takes, because it's a fast learner. But you have to train it over and over and over, the same way you train your dog to sit, lay down, and over. You don't just do it one time and walk away. You have to reinforce it, and that's why we have 6 weeks. 6 weeks gets it started and going. The first 2 weeks you get started and going. The middle 2 weeks you're starting to see it show up, and then the last set of 2 weeks, weeks 5 and 6, you can really use it under pressure. And in that, we rewrite the bias. We rewrite the threat bias, so it doesn't assume that new stimuli are threats. It assumes that they're not a threat, and that avoids. Oh, I didn't finish. So we have the fight or flight activation is happening with mobilization, if it's fight or flight, or calm in the example I'm using. And then we have the trajectory set, which is translating the signal into thought. And if we don't have good present moment, then that response becomes what the reaction was. And we don't want our reaction to equal our response. And this one is what happens if we let our reactions become the stimulus. So it's a reaction to reaction to reaction to reaction is what's happening here. And we don't want that. I think part of the trouble is that people don't realize that this sequence is happening 30,000 times a day. Easily. This stimulus reaction response is happening 30,000 times a day, but most of them are unconscious. Most of them are below our radar, so we don't even know it's happening. If you recognize it as happening 30,000 times a day, you realize the importance of getting back to coherence and maintaining a present moment. Otherwise, this can very easily happen. This is why people think, something bad happened in the morning, it's going to ruin their entire day. It's going to ruin their entire week, because they're so used to letting reactions become the new stimulus, when in reality, you get to reset that every second when you're using agency. Now, I've mentioned a couple of times, let's use the behavioral habits that are easy to change to make a difference with the reactivity habits where it's difficult to change. And I'm not going to go into detail here because it's just a lot. I'll do this in the webinar next Friday if I do choose to have it. I'll do this in the full webinar. I'll add some time because we have to walk through the exercises. But you can do this as a DY. It's pretty straightforward. You go out to 7stepreset.com/live, and I have a similar pattern out there for getting rid of uhs and ums. And it's essentially a process to replace habits that you don't want with an action that you do want. Same principle. So here's what, again, there's the website. Let me just show you. Just take a screenshot of that. 7stepreset.com/live. That's also where you're going to see your information about cognitive biases. You'll find the uhs and the ums video, etc. and other resources, clips from past talks. All right, so here's step one. You're first going to identify, it's called transformation of vocabulary, also cognitive appraisal, changing the meaning. This was actually around well before neuroplasticity, 60s and 70s, what happened in the 90s is that it was recognized with neuroimaging that transformational vocabulary, not only does it work in terms of getting people off the edge, but it changes the lighting up the areas that light up in the brain. So they recognize that transformational vocabulary is actually a major change to the network of neurons in real time. And that's why it's a keeper. So I pick 2 or 3 disempowering words or heavy labels you habitually use. Then you're going to replace those and come up with milder constructive alternative words to lower emotional intensity. And then also redefine, assign the old word a brand new high agency definition, which turns a trigger into a performance metric. So I'll go through this and show you what I mean, then we'll go through you'll be able to take screenshots. I learned this 35 years ago, and at the time I was selling and training salespeople, and I was looking for a way to overcome call reluctance, because it's something that most new salespeople experience. So how do you overcome call reluctance? Because call reluctance mapped back to a fear of rejection or dislike of rejection. And there were some salespeople that they just went through it, and then it just went away. They no longer had call reluctance. And other people struggle with call reluctance. They've been selling for 30 years and they still struggle with call reluctance. So I was trying to figure out what is it that it's about the people who break through it and the ones who don't. And I came up with this using transformational vocabulary. I'll use the word rejection. So if call reluctance stems from a fear of rejection, and you could put any other, you could say fear of public speaking, you could say fear of starting a business, you could say fear of asking for a raise, you could say fear of negotiating your salary, put anything you want there. But I used rejection. So first thing is identify. So if rejection is that powerful, let's get rid of the word rejection and turn it into something else. The word I came up with was unappreciated. So from rejection to unappreciated. Rejection is charged and carries some energy and some negative connotation with it. Unappreciated doesn't. And also rejection is something somebody's doing to you, versus unappreciated is a choice you're making. You're not going to compromise your integrity. So you'd rather be unappreciated than compromise your integrity, as an example. So we replace it. You go through a process to replace it. This is what, like the uhs and the ums. This is replacing the ums with a pause. You're replacing it. You come up with a milder constructive term. So we get rid of rejection, and it's unappreciated. Did you make the sale? Did you make the appointment? No, they didn't appreciate the offer. And move on. It's not, I was rejected. No. And then the third, this is what makes it really powerful. And everyone who uses this approach doesn't teach this part of it. But what makes it powerful is you redefine and assign the old word with a new high agency definition. So I took rejection and said, if rejection is that powerful, let's turn the word rejection, redefine it to, if I don't pursue my goals because of fear, that I'm rejected. What we're doing with that is we're taking a myelinated neural pathway. It's been fired, has a lot of emotion, it's been built over years. It's a strong neural pathway, and we repurpose it. So we're not trying to break down the myelin because it's not easy to break down. You can move the synapses with synaptogenesis from that pathway to another, but that pathway is still going to be strong. So we leverage it by redefining it to rejection is not pursuing my goals because of fear. Now that fires it, and then there's a process. I'll show you. That's what we'll get into the slides of how to do it. So screenshot that, because you have to do that step first, and I would recommend doing 3 or 4. I went from embarrassment. I took embarrassment and changed it to amused. So instead of embarrassed, I was amused, because I was doing public speaking at the time. And one of the things you always get concerned about is I go up there and my zipper's open, or, whatever, you got a stain on your shirt. And, it's like, oh, it'd be so embarrassing. Well, no, it's not embarrassing, it's amusing. So I change it. So it takes the energy. Guess what? When you take that energy out of it, it's easier to go up on stage and speak. And then I also used overwhelm to time to chunk up, or time to group. That's the reference to we can handle 7 to 9 chunks of information. So if you're feeling overwhelmed, it's because you are exceeding that 7 to 9 chunks of information that can be processed by the conscious mind at a time. And by chunking up, you're grouping it. So now we're back down to 5 chunks. Same way if you want to remember a string of numbers, it's instead of remembering 386, 579, 42, you could remember 386, 579. That's easy to remember. You're chunking them, you're grouping. So instead of having overwhelm, and literally took those words out of my vocabulary. And what happens with transformation of vocabulary is when you take those words out of your vocabulary, you also take the emotion out, because the emotion is connected to those words. So if I don't describe it as rejection, all those associations that used to fire with the rejection, they don't fire. And when I do use the word rejections for a different reason, that was the whole repurposing. So now, while I go through the steps, we don't need to go through the steps. You're just going to screenshot the last slide. So that's the main slide there. And you can why you understand why you do it. At some point you were conditioned. It comes back to safety, survival, right? Why you want to change it, make sure there's a reason, and make sure that a reason is aligned with your quest. Imagine bad news, and then I'll just let you watch the video on uhs and ums on the 7stepreset.com/live. And then we have steps 8 through 11. Take the heavy disempowering word. This is the replacement. So the first one was the replacement. This is the redefinition. So here's where you're installing the new definition. And the last step is spend a few minutes daily for a couple weeks just jotting down, writing down how the old word rejection, it has a new meaning of not following through on your goals because of fear. Now, when I talk about moving from using behavioral type habits to reduce reactivity, I'll also talk about creating structural boundaries, because if you're not there, it can't happen to you. So one of the easiest ways to stop reactivity is to not be there. And I don't mean, when I say structural boundaries, I'm not talking about the passive aggressive stuff. I'm talking about healthy boundaries. So put in structural boundaries, and sometimes transformational vocabulary can be seen as a structural boundary. Then we have in this next one, this is the pre-listening, and in that pre-stimulus part, we have preemptive priming. So we are priming ourselves rather than letting our reactive habits, our reactivity type behavioral habits, prime us to more negative stuff. This gets back to the inverted U, the pressure curve. We're not priming ourselves. Now the only things that are causing us reactivity is external threats, or external stimuli, and cognitive biases. I already talked about having some mechanisms, automaticity mechanisms, so that we discount cognitive biases. So now the only ones you're dealing with are external threats. And how many external threats do you really get in a day? Very, very small number. Most of your threats were coming from internal priming. So we stopped that with the habits that I just now talked about and more. And then we have the dynamic interception. And this is like when I was describing the driver, moving the steering wheel very rapidly just by the seat of their pants. That's what we're doing here. You feel that spike come up. Don't wait for it to turn into meaning and a threat and a trajectory that's going off into spiral land. You change it right away. Whether it's conditioning in a breath, taking in a breath. In this zone here, we do a lot of the positivity exercises, that 6-week exercise, because we want to just eliminate it. We don't even want them to happen. But when they do slip through, you can use things like a breath, you can use things like an anchoring back to a positive state or a blissful state, something like that. Same thing with this dynamic modulation. So we have the interception and the modulation. This is just automatic, adding automatic changes that you already know. So box breathing, the 4-7-8 breathing, taking a deep breath, breathing out through your nostril, looking away, standing up tall, going outside. These, just anything that, standing up, looking out the window, anything that you can interrupt your pattern. But what I'm showing you with these curves is that the earlier you do it, the greater the impact and the less effort. If you wait too long, it takes a lot more effort and the impact is very small. So we want to automate those things here. If I'm getting that little spike coming up because I got bad news and I feel that spike coming up, I know it's not a tiger, so why let it materialize into something bigger than it's not? As soon as that little spike comes, I can immediately look away and say, this is not that. What else could it be? whatever I've conditioned in, I have different ones I use, it arrests it before it even starts. And now, instead of it recruiting other neurons, and because when it's trying to figure out what's the meaning, it's recruiting other neurons, it's neurons that fire together, wire together, more associations, et cetera, et cetera. So the earlier we get it, the better we are. And if you wait till after here, you have dynamic regulation. That's your last shot because now it's preconscious surfacing. What's interesting is when you look at emotional intelligence, most of emotional intelligence regulation begins here. So that word regulation is self-regulation is more like prevention, modulation, regulation, but the prevention and modulation is done over here, and so it's sort of out of scope with emotional intelligence because most of what they're talking about is conscious mind, stuff done with the conscious mind. I'm using neuroplasticity, and it's accessible to anybody, using neuroplasticity to automate that regulation and turn it into modulation, just like that driver making the car look really, really stable by many, many micro inputs. And that way, now we're looking at regulation side, not as regulation, but now it's corrective action. So we're going to avoid the corrective action by doing it early. And if you wait even longer, now it's cleanup. So we don't need that. So we saw this one already, and I think I've made the point there. And then this is the same slide. Here's some things that you can do though in the readiness. You can change your perpetual question. So instead of asking a question like, am I safe? Am I going to be okay? Why can't I do anything right? You're going to ask a more empowering question. And then the orientation. This is your conditioned trajectory bias. This is what I was talking about, where you create your new trajectory by letting the subconscious assume that it's not a threat. And then we have firing a pre-trained anchor. So I do 15-second inhale, 15-second exhale is one of my rituals in the morning while I'm hydrating. That 15-second inhale and 15-second exhale, and I do a top off and a bottom out. So I use a watch, and it buzzes at 15 seconds, but I always have room. And so at the 15-second mark, I top off, which is you'll see in the breathing exercises coming up soon. And then at the bottom, I bottom out. So I'm exhaling, I get all of it out, but then when the buzzer hits, I get the rest of it out. And these are like martial arts breathing exercises, but there are books, entire books written on breath work. Breath work is so powerful. And let's see. So here's the stop saying uhs and ums. You can look at that one as well. There's the video's about 13 minutes that I do. So here's your steps on that one. Again, why do you use filler words? For safety, because the teacher said, don't, what are you looking at the ceiling for? It's not in the ceiling, so we start saying to hold them at bay. Why do you want to change it? Because if you're telling a story to inspire somebody, you mess that story up when you start saying especially if you're using predictable ums. There's some, and these are unconscious. People don't even know they're doing it, the kind I'm talking about. And it's predictable. You kind of know, oh, here comes another one. You can do a bet, right? Over, under. They're going to say because it comes with new sentences or new paragraphs or responding to a question or changing the subject. All of those things will be preceded by an because is how the network of neurons looks for information. But when you're verbalizing the it actually interferes with the network of neurons finding the information. Then we intentionally add a pause. You leverage the pause. You practice giving commentary while pausing intentionally and also using the pause to create emotion. Like, I want to convey some emotion. How can I put a pause in here? Sometimes when I'm reading from the teleprompter, I'll put a pause in there to look at the next few lines and think about how do I want to respond. And if the teleprompter is set up to follow your voice, it's very easy to do that. You can pause all you want and read the next few lines and then come back with some emotion and energy that's aligned. And then we have rapidly switch the picture with good picture. That's a process, but essentially this is like saying stay to the dog when you want them to stay after you teach them to sit. But you're coming up with a picture about to say and then you blow it up with another picture of you being a polished speaker, etc. And practice daily for about a week. It takes a week to get this to lock in because neuroplasticity happens overnight. The first thing that you'll notice is awareness. Then you'll notice that you can redirect it real time. And then you'll eliminate it. But the one thing I tell people when we're doing these behavioral habits, changing them, These processes I'm introducing, they will they will show you the door, they'll open the door, but you still have to walk through. If you choose not to walk through, you're not going to make progress with the thing. So we've seen this one already. You don't have to engage. This is the 7 stages of agency. You don't have to engage. And on the other side, we don't want to do cleanup and rework. So you're going to automate it here. And I'm going to illustrate something because I think it makes a lot of sense before we step into the 4th pillar. So here's the breath work. I'll wrap up the 3rd pillar. Here's the breath work. I'm not going to go through it. I'll show you the next slides. So you have the physiological side. Those are powerful. And you can look all this stuff up. Box breathing. Most of you are probably familiar with that. Intentionally speak slow. If you're talking to somebody, you can just slow down intentionally, or you can verbalize. You can state what you're thinking about. You can verbalize that. I've gone through training where the idea was that you actually articulate what you're planning on doing because it refines things. And everybody's been in a situation where they thought they understood something, but when you start explaining it, you realize you have gaps and holes. And then physical tension and release. This is something you can just squeeze the chair. Take the pen and squeeze the pen and then release it. Squeeze and release. These are interrupts, but you're conditioning them automatically. And then the 3rd pillar is state mastery. So let me go to the pad. Well, I'll do this first. 3rd pillar, state mastery, personal leadership, agency, and expansion. Accessing the best version of yourself requires being in a high performance state. Cell behavior is like human behavior, 2 configurations. Either we're pursuing nutrients and growth, or we're in a configuration where we're in protection mode. Cells can't be in both at the same time. And humans, similarly, you're either in growth and contribution mode, or you're in, getting small mode. You're playing it safe. It's very difficult to be in fight or flight and pursuing with untapped potential, the best version of yourself. You can't perform at your best if you're stressed, and that gets back to that inverted U pressure curve. And here's another way to look at it. State mastery. The middle is stabilized. This is where we're going to spend most of our time, but if you spend most of your time in stabilized, occasionally you're going to fall into destabilized. What we want to do is spend time in agency, make this the default, so when you fall off your rocker, you slip to stabilize and you can get back. Expansion is a little bit more. Expansion is something you're going to do in bits here and there because it's like leveling up your game. Like for an athlete who they step up the level of their game, you're not going to do that for long periods of time because it just takes too much. But you can live in agency 24/7, and then you have spurts up into expansion, and the worst case scenario is stabilized, and you're taking destabilized and collapsed off the table. Collapsed would be like crashing out. Destabilized would be like agitated, cognitive narrowing, getting into that red mist kind of zone where you're just not able to access the best version of yourself. So let's do this. Oh, I see. Hold on. And it sure is easier when one of the cameras working to navigate with this kind of thing. Okay, so that looks like yeah, my, there we go. All right. So that's getting into the, starting to get into understanding why the automaticity has such an important place with respect to how much pressure we're absorbing. If you think about the reactivity habits and the power that reactivity habits have over our trajectory, you recognize that this gap that's happening because of artificial intelligence, and it didn't start with artificial intelligence. It was there with technology. It was there with the networking. It was there with the digital, and it was there with the computational. So all of that started, but now it's just gotten so big that you have people being overwhelmed. They're overwhelmed before they even start their day because there's so much uncertainty. Yeah, thank you for that note. I appreciate that. I'll send you a DM if you want to have maybe join in or have a conversation. I'm fascinated by teaching this neuroplasticity because there's so many things to unpeel here. Now, and this wandering, I think what I'm going to do, just for those people who've been here since the beginning of the day, I am going to really simplify. I'm going live on multiple platforms, and I use multiple cameras, and the incremental value of the additional cameras in terms of quality, because it's really about the message, the incremental value of the additional cameras is not worth the risk. So I'm probably going to simplify and go to something that's very simple, suboptimal, and then just worry about capturing the image that I want so that when I do reuse the content, I can use a good image. I'm just telling you that for those of you who are thinking about going live or thinking about doing multimedia. All right, so we got this. Now, here's my 7-step reset. The 7-step reset framework. Step 1, you saw this already, beliefs, neuroplasticity, priming, mindset, and then psychology. Step 2, coherence versus chaos and rigidity. This is like a river. When the river is wide with coherence, you have less chaos and less rigidity. This is from Dan Siegel, Neurobiology of Relationships. If you allow your coherence to go down, your chaos and your rigidity are going to grow. Chaos is like crashing out at the extreme. Rigidity is like fixed mindset. Here's your 7 phases, or the 3 zones of the habit side. It's phases, 7 phases actually, but it's really 3 zones of the first 600 milliseconds, and then there's habits associated with those zones. And then we have step 4, which is your response. Step 5, emotional modulation. Step 6 is action. Step 7 is return to mindfulness, so that we can get back here for step 1 to get into coherence. Here's emotional modulation. I'll spend more time here later, but if you take all your uncomfortable emotions, this is according to Joan Rosenberg, the book is 90 Seconds to a Life You Love, all uncomfortable emotions can be distilled down to these eight types, these eight labels: sadness, shame, helplessness, anger, embarrassment, disappointment, frustration, and vulnerability. They can all be reduced to these 8, and then the idea is to locate it, label it, and learn from it. And by doing so, you're preventing that anxiety to turn into a neurobiological event. Emotion is energy in motion. It processes in about 90 seconds. So we have about 1 to 90 seconds to get this thing processed. And the reason I have it as step 5 is because when you do this work, you're not going to have a lot of emotional hijacking going on. But as part of step 4, with the response, we're going to do a quick check-in to see, do we need to emotionally modulate before we take action? Because we don't want to be taking action in a heightened state of emotion. And that's why I have it as step 5, because we don't always need it. But I also do some automaticity so that we do emotional modulation. This is what I was talking about earlier. That's why I didn't want to get into it, because it wouldn't make as much sense. But We use some in that dynamic regulation and dynamic modulation. We're doing some automated emotional modulation up here because you can make almost anything into a habit. It's almost like macros in Excel or macros in Word. If you can do the steps, you can turn it into a macro. If you can do the steps, you can turn it into a habit. And if you can have it as a habit, we can install it with neuroplasticity. And then there's your step 6. Do it, delay it, delegate it, discard it. And then here's the allostatic neuroplasticity. The best example I have of allostasis is a through hiker. So through hikers are people who go from like Mexico to Canada on a 90-day hike about 3,000 miles. When they start out hikes, they're roughly doing 7, 8, 9 miles depending on their experience per day. If they pace themselves and they do the work right, they've done their homework, they're going to finish that hike doing 30 miles a day, sometimes for as much as 10 days in a row. Imagine that. 30, that's like 10, that's more than 10 marathons 10 days in a row, or a marathon 10 days in every day, 10 days in a row. That's allostasis. And if you look at them at the before and after, they might look slightly different, but it's not like they lost 30% of their weight. They didn't gain X amount of muscle. They still look pretty much like they did before, maybe a little more toned, but not like 7 miles a day to 30 miles a day different. And that's because it's not the muscle, it's the signal. And allostasis is a way of using neuroplasticity to get stability at the upward trajectory. And it does so by constantly letting the brain know that it has to generate more neurotransmitter. The additional neurotransmitter, it's hard for the brain because it's metabolically expensive, and so the brain wants to be efficient. But you can, the same way a trainer will switch up the routines so people don't hit that plateau. The plateau is like homeostasis, and by switching up the routines, you keep the client climbing. That's allostasis. The same way athletes drill until the right move is automatic under pressure. Leaders and professionals can rewire the first half second of a stimulus reaction response cycle. When pressure hits, you want your best response to fire first, not the old default. So these are the things that we condition in. And we don't need to add skills, we need to install stability. And by adding the stability, we have more access to the best version of ourselves because we're not losing it in chaos and rigidity. Homeostatic coaching gets you back to normal. Allostatic coaching creates a new trajectory. And part of that allostatic coaching involves in making sure we're running laps around the 7, 1, and 2. Return to mindfulness from the last stimulus reaction response cycle, leveraging the fundamentals and the levers, using it as a dashboard, checking our coherence, and getting back there every single time. This is so important. And then if you look at steps 3, 4, 5, 6, that's just life. That's just one foot in front of the other, widgets in, widgets out. Step 3 is stimulus reaction response. Then you got your responses, stimulus reaction. Then 4 is your response. 5 is the emotional modulation if you need it. 6 is the action you're going to take. That is the inside. These are the skills. We've trained for this. We know how to do that. The big work is back to mindfulness, ready for the next stimulus. So I'm in coherence or have high coherence. And then you execute again. And because this is happening 30,000 times a day, it makes sense that you're good at getting back to coherence. And here's the 4th pillar, performance hygiene. This is the one where I was talking about forgiveness, but there's other things. Nutrition, reducing oxidative waste with your diet. The less oxidative waste, the less inflammation you're going to have. Hydration. Remember, the brain gets its nutrients and oxygen from the blood. If you have thick blood, i.e. dehydrated, the brain, it takes more work to get the blood and nutrients and oxygen to the brain. Forgiveness, I talked about that a little bit, right? Closed doors to random triggers. We're going to use forgiveness to literally work through those little T's and move them along. So you're using a combination of emotional modulation as you do the forgiveness. So when that emotion comes up, you process it. And when I talk about forgiveness, it's not about morality. It's about performance hygiene. I do not suggest that you expose yourself to more pain and trauma or risk. I'm not suggesting that. You can, but when I say forgiveness, I'm talking about for you. There's too many people that they've traced cancer back to carrying resentment around. You don't want to be carrying around resentment. This is doing nothing to the person you're resenting. It's doing a lot against yourself. So forgiveness, and it closes doors to random triggers. That's going to make it easier to predict your relationship time. And then we have specific exercise, all out intervals, 7 to 15 seconds. This is the core of allostasis. It's not like HIIT. HIIT can have 3 HIIT, high intensity interval training, can have intervals of 2 and 3 minutes long. They all have recovery, but this all out is 7 to 15 seconds. Think sprinting. You sprint for 10 seconds and then you take a minute recovery. But sprinting requires a lot of recovery. Sprinting is easy for injury to happen if you haven't been doing it. You work up to it, and one of the ways to work up to it is with footwork drills. And guess what? Footwork drills hit the same factors as all-out sprint. So if you look at sprinting and you say, what are the benefits of sprinting? Just do a search. What are the benefits of sprinting? You're going to see things like improved BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor, mitochondria. Mitochondria like the organs and cells. You got 50 trillion cells. Imagine if all those organs are better, 10 or 15% better. Anti-inflammation. So literally, even doing this hard work reduces your inflammation. Increases testosterone for men, estrogen for women after menopause. AMPK improves your metabolic efficiency. Proprioception, placing your limbs. So, you see somebody who's a little bit older and they take a step and they stumble a little bit. It's like that stumbling can last for, like a whole minute. Not really, but 3 or 4 steps because their proprioception is off. They're not using those skills. It's like they stumble and stumble and stumble. Whereas you have an athlete, they take a bad step and boom, they catch themselves right away. So by doing sprinting and footwork drills, hitting these 7 factors, you're improving that. And the 7 factors: intention, novelty, precision, balance for physical, complexity for cognitive, progression, intensity for cognitive, explosiveness for physical, and then struggle at the edge of ability. What's interesting is these same 7 factors are present in gaming. And most of us know somebody who plays games for hours and hours at a time, and you look at how games are set up with the levels and the increasing complexity and the reward mechanisms and all that, and the risk and the reward. That's it. That's the allostasis. And this is how through hikers go from 7 miles a day to 30 miles a day, doing something that they love. Here's the forgiveness protocol, steps 1 through 4, and you could just screenshot that. If you want, I'll do 1. Identify and isolate, access the anchor, deconstruct it, process the charge, and it's all explained there. You can look at it. And then here's the second 4, the 5 through 8. Screenshot. Extract the lessons. So we're always going to learn from it. And this is the forgiveness process. Now, when you're doing the forgiveness protocol, I start with something small and then build up. And if you find yourself not being able to forgive the person, don't worry about it. Go do it again the next day, do it again the next day, because neuroplasticity will happen in between. And remember, we're not trying to expose yourself to more harm, and we're not excusing the person from their bad behavior. We're just forgiving them. And you know the thing, you can forgive and not forget, but you can forgive and decide you still never want to ever be around them. That's fine. The point is, let's remove the source of resentment from yourself. Then we have reframe the perspective. So looking at it from their point of view. Hurt people hurt people. They probably had harder times than you, and maybe hurting you was just a way for them to try to heal on their own. And then you have this one, shifting through their eyes. This is good to do just as a standalone. When you're having an intense conversation with somebody and you're reflecting on it later on, this is when you're by yourself. You can do it real time too, but after the conversation, when you're reflecting, just imagine going around and looking at yourself over their shoulder, watching your facial expression, listening to your tonality, listening to how you talk. You'd be surprised sometimes. Sometimes that simple step will show you that you're wrong, and you end up calling the other person saying, I just want to acknowledge something. I actually had it wrong, blah, blah, blah. And then the last one is release them. And, it says if you want, you can kind of imagine, can you give them a hug? And when you know you can give them a hug, you've released it. So there's your 4 pillars of self-mastery. The fundamentals: habit mastery, state mastery, and performance hygiene. And You can find more resources, as I said, at 7stepreset.com/live. There's your 7 steps. And I actually offer a program where we'll do this. You can do a big thing or a little thing. The little thing is we do this 7-step reset personalized. So everything I just went through, the 4 pillars of self-mastery, but extracting the parts that make sense for you. And since you've already gone through this training and have the vernacular and some of the common language, I do a special deal where we'll automate this, not automate it, personalize it. This is the exit ramp. We do the exit ramp on one day and the on ramp on another day because we want some neuroplasticity to happen in between. And then the quest, you're left with a blueprint for your quest. So we build the blueprint on the first day. We build your exit ramp on the first day. Then you come back a day or more later and we do the second day. And that second day is the on ramp. And we'll also lay out some pieces of the blueprint. And we can do that for $99. The reason why it's such a low price is because I'm introducing the bigger program that I do. But also, as I said, you've already been through this. So it's going to be a quick study because you already know the content. But yeah, just use 7stepreset.com/reset. So the live is where you go for resources. The /reset is where you go to sign up for this special $99. 4 pillars of self-mastery is personalized. You keep the blueprint no matter what you decide. If after the first session you feel like it's not for you, you want to change your mind, you get your money back. I don't want your money if this is not going to be something you do. If you go through the second day, not only do you keep the blueprint, but you also maintain access to the library. So you will get access to the library, and that library has over 90 videos, blogs, articles, and I'm working right now through, because most of the videos are 30 to 45 minutes long, so I'm working through now creating a summary and a table of contents for them so it's easy to find. But the reason I have that library is so I don't have to send people to a book. I've done a lot of research, read a lot of books, hundreds of books. So rather than recommend books so that people can get 3 pages worth of information, I can just direct them to a video in the library. And then we'll also open up some self-coaching and group coaching, I should say, for people. But yeah, get your own personalized 7-step reset experience. $99, 7stepreset.com/reset, and I will see you on the other side. I'll do this again next week, 10 o'clock Pacific time. Tell your friends, tell your associates if they're into this content, have them show up. Same platform, Transformation After 50 on TikTok, and the various ones on YouTube and Facebook. And I'll put those on 7stepreset.com. I'll put them on 7stepreset.com/live so you can go to the platforms if you prefer watching there rather than on TikTok or wherever. All right, we'll see you next time.